in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat sewing by a window with a black ebony frame. As she sewed, she looked out at the snow and pricked her finger with her needle, causing 3 drops of blood to fall onto the white snow. The red against the white looked so beautiful that she sighed and said to herself, "Oh, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of this frame." Not long after, her wish came true. She gave birth to a little daughter who had skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. They named her Snow White. Sadly, soon after Snow White was born, the queen died. Some time passed, and Snow White's father, the king, his new wife was a beautiful woman, but she was also very proud and arrogant, and she could not bear it if anyone surpassed her in beauty. She possessed a magical mirror. Every day, she would stand in front of this mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror would always reply, "You, O Queen, are fairest of all." The queen was then satisfied, for she knew that the magic mirror spoke the truth. As Snow White grew older, she became more and more beautiful. By the time she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and even more beautiful than the queen herself. One day, the queen stood in front of her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" This time, the mirror replied, "You, O Queen, are fair, 'tis true, but Snow White is fairer than you." The queen was shocked and turned yellow with envy. From that moment on, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart turned over in her breast, so great was her hatred for the young girl. The queen, consumed by envy and rage, called for a huntsman. She said to him, "Take Snow White into the woods. I never want to see her again. You must kill her, and to prove it, bring me back her lungs and liver." The huntsman, though he was frightened, had to obey the queen's command. He took Snow White into the woods, but as he raised his knife, Snow White began to weep and said, "Oh, dear huntsman, let me live. I will run far into the woods and never come home again." The huntsman felt pity for her beauty. "Run away, then, you poor child," he said. He didn't have the heart to kill her. Instead, he killed a young wild boar and took its lungs and liver back to the queen, who believed she had finally gotten rid of Snow White. Alone in the woods, Snow White was very scared. Wild animals ran past her, but they did not harm her. After wandering alone for a long time, just as evening was beginning to fall, Snow White saw a little cottage and went inside to rest. Everything in the cottage was small, but very neat and clean. There was a table laid with 7 little plates, each with a little spoon, a little knife and fork, and a little mug. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, each covered with a white quilt. Snow White was very hungry and thirsty, so she ate a little food from each plate and drank a little wine from each mug. Then, feeling tired, she lay down on one of the little beds, but none of them quite fit her. Finally, the 7th little bed was just right, and she fell asleep fast. Later that evening, the 7 dwarfs who owned the cottage came home. They were miners who dug for gold in the mountains. When the 7 dwarfs entered their cottage, they lit their 7 little lamps, and saw that someone had been there. The first dwarf said, "Who has been sitting on my little chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who has been taking some of my little bread?" The fourth said, "Who has been eating my little porridge?" The fifth said, "Who has been using my little fork?" The sixth said, "Who has been cutting with my little knife?" The 7th said, "Who has been drinking out of my little mug?" Then the first dwarf looked around and saw a little dent in his bed. The others looked at their beds and saw the same. The seventh dwarf looked at his bed and saw Snow White lying there, fast asleep. The 7 dwarfs were astonished. They called out, and Snow White woke up. She was frightened when she saw the 7 little men, but they were friendly and asked her how she had come to their house. Snow White told them the whole story of how her stepmother had tried to kill her, and how the huntsman had spared her life. The dwarfs took pity on her and said, "If you will keep house for us, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, you can stay with us, and you shall have everything you want." Snow White agreed, and so she stayed with the 7 dwarfs. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the wicked queen believed that Snow White was dead. She stood before her mirror once more and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror replied, "O Queen, are fair, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 dwarfs, is fairer by far than then." The queen was furious when she heard this, for she knew that the mirror never lied. She realized that the huntsman had deceived her and that Snow White was still alive. Consumed by anger, she plotted to kill Snow White herself. The wicked queen disguised herself as an old peddler woman. She painted her face, dressed in old clothes, and took a basket filled with poisoned trinket. She traveled over the 7 hills to the dwarf's cottage. When she arrived, she knocked on the door and called out, "Pretty things to sell, fine laces and ribbons." Snow White peeked out of the window and said, "I must not let anyone in." "But surely you can look," said the old woman, holding up a beautiful, brightly colored ribbon. Snow White was tempted by the pretty ribbon, and thinking no harm could come from an old woman, she opened the door. "Look, my pretty," said the queen, "I'll give you this ribbon for nothing." She wound the ribbon tightly around Snow White's waist, so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. The wicked queen, satisfied with her deed, went away laughing. Later that evening, the 7 dwarfs returned home. They were horrified to find Snow White lying on the floor, not breathing. They lifted her up, and when they saw how tightly the ribbon was laced around her waist, they cut it. Snow White began to breathe again, and slowly came back to life. The dwarfs knew then that the old peddler woman must have been the wicked queen. They warned Snow White to be careful and not to let anyone into the house while they were away. The queen, furious that Snow White had survived, disguised herself again, this time as a comb seller. She offered Snow White a beautiful, poisoned comb. Snow White, thinking she was harmless, took the comb and put it in her hair. Immediately, she fell down lifeless. When the dwarfs returned, they found Snow White seemingly dead. This time, when they removed the comb, the poison took effect, and she revived. Enraged, the queen then disguised herself as a farmer's wife and prepared a poisoned apple. The red side looked tempting, but the other side was laced with deadly poison. She went to the dwarf's cottage and offered Snow White the apple. Snow White hesitated, but the queen cut the apple in half and ate the white side, pretending it was delicious. Snow White couldn't resist, and took a bite of the red, poisoned side, and instantly fell down dead. This time, the dwarfs couldn't revive her. They laid her in a glass coffin on the mountainside, where animals and birds mourned for her. Time passed, and one day a prince came riding by. He saw the glass coffin on the mountainside, and the beautiful Snow White lying inside. He was so taken by her beauty that he begged the dwarfs to let him have the coffin, promising to treasure and honor her. The dwarfs, seeing his sincerity, agreed. As the prince's servants were carrying the coffin away, they stumbled, and the jolt dislodged the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. Snow White awoke. The prince was overjoyed and declared his love for her. Snow White loved him in return, and they decided to marry. The wicked queen was invited to the wedding. When she arrived, she saw Snow White alive and well, and recognized the prince. Consumed by rage and terror, her own wicked magic turned against her, and she met a terrible end. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after,